Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Haman Talks NRL SuperCoach. Today's video, we're going to be going through the halfback position profile video. So if you guys enjoy it, do please drop it a like. As at the time of recording, we are 13 subscribers away from the magic 2,000 number. So really appreciate the support so far. And if you're one of those 13 who haven't subscribed yet to the content and you do enjoy it, do consider hitting that button. Really appreciate all the support. But enough of the plugs, let's get straight into the video. So as always, going to start off by looking at the halfback position and how it has compared in the past 3 seasons in terms of players and where they sit in terms of the top averaging players. So no surprise that guys like Nicho Hynes and Nathan Cleary were very close to the top averaging players in 2022. Nicho Hynes had an outstanding year. Nathan Cleary is just super consistent. You can see 2021 and 2020, he was in second place just behind some fullbacks in top form. But Cleary is obviously going to be the most consistent gun halfback that you could go for. Nicho Hynes showed tremendous growth from 2021 to 2022. A couple of not quite as high guys, but someone like a Jerome Hughes has been really good the last 2 seasons. He's featured in the top 20 averaging players, both in 19th and 18th respectively. So on that trend, he should be the 17th highest averaging player in 2023, but also a breakout year for Mitchell Moses. So you can see on average the last 2 seasons, we've had about 4 halfbacks form the top 20 averaging. Nathan Cleary is a mainstay. There's probably a good chance that Nicho Hynes is going to stay in that boat as well. There are a lot of questions about Nicho Hynes in this video that we will definitely cover because he is coming in extremely expensive at over 900,000. But I think what this does show is that the halfback position is a good high upside position to target, that can consistently average well, but also hit those really big 100 and 150 point scores. Surprisingly, only 2 halfbacks were actually in the top 20 in terms of total point scoring last year. One was Nicho Hynes, and second was actually Mitchell Moses. Despite Cleary having a pretty solid average, he obviously did miss a lot of games after that big suspension. Also had a couple of injury niggles from memory as well, which did delay his return coming into the season as well. But look, we all know, I think, the quality of someone like Nathan Cleary. More a question of, do we think guys like Nicho Hynes and Mitchell Moses, who had pretty good 2022s, can they back that up again in 2023? So let's answer that question. So taking a look at some of the gun halfback players that you can consider. Thankfully, I've been able to also add now in ownership percentages from the actual SuperCoach game. And to be honest, no surprise that Nathan Cleary comes well out on top at 57% ownership. He is expensive at 841k, but as that previous table showed you, he has been the most consistent halfback gun that we've got in this game. And to be honest, I feel he had a bit of a down 2022, an average of 79.9. But remember, that's going to be including a Parramatta game where he scored 4 points. So an average of 80, where you're including a game of 4, you take that game out and his average immediately goes up to 86. And I think that's realistically where you're actually going to get Nathan Cleary, at around that kind of mid-80s average. For me, he's almost 100% locked into my round 1 team. I cannot see a situation where I don't have Nathan Cleary. Even having that bye in round 3, the Broncos, Rabbitohs, Parramatta, Canberra and Manly, it's not, to be honest, the easiest draw on paper, I'll give you that. But we know the Panthers are so good, no Api Coruscant now, so I feel like someone like Jerome Luai and Nathan Cleary are going to have to step up, and Cleary he just seems to get better and better with every season, just an actual NRL. So for me, there's really no question mark that, if I don't want to have Cleary in my starting team, I 100% would recommend him as well. Super consistent, 64% of his games were over 60, and 28% of his games were over the score of 100. Again, shows you that he's got that ceiling, but he can also hit it very, very consistently. If you take a look at the chart below me as well, with halfbacks, it's harder to compare, things like base stats because they're generally going to be lower in comparison to, say, when we're using that as a stat to compare like the forwards. But I guess what you can just see from Cleary is that he's just got very, very healthy creative stats because he's so involved in the Panthers attack. It's the best of any of these other halfbacks here. The scoring is always going to be very good because he's the goal kicker, can obviously go over for a few tries as well. While I don't like to use must-have that often when it comes to players, I do feel like Cleary is a must-have. I do think he's actually slightly undervalued as well because that 4-point game is coming into his price tag. So for me, Cleary is absolutely set and forget into my team. Now, the biggest question I think really comes down to Nicho Hynes, sitting at the top of the table, over $900,000, top point scorer for 2022, an average of 86. 78% of his games he scored over 60, 26% of his games he scored over 100, only owned by 26% of SuperCoaches as of the time that I pull these figures. So obviously you're looking at a lot of teams on Twitter and social media. You are seeing a lot of teams that are running both the Cleary and the Hynes combination. Hynes' stats base stats actually really solid for a halfback. 32, that is comparable to some of the top 5'8 guns, someone like a Dylan Brown or a Cam Munster. A base of 32 from Hynes is actually really good, but on top of that, he goal kicks, sets up tries. He is the focal point of that Sharks attack. And even from 2021, bit of an outlier season in terms of the scoring in the NRL, but Hynes did show that even at that point in time, when he gets a crack at either the number 6 or the number 1 jersey, he is a genuine Supercoach gun. So I don't think we really need to talk too much more about his credentials. For me, Hynes is the second best halfback gun, I think just behind Nathan Cleary. I think the question is obviously then, do we want to force both of these guys into our starting team? Because obviously it does take up a lot of money. So I'm going to slightly change tack here, and instead of talking about all of those players in that table, I wanted to have this separate slide just on Nicho Hynes, because I think he really is the biggest talking point of the halfbacks. And so I've got this question from Twitter from Bahama Golfer. Factoring the Sharks opening draw, is Nicho Hynes too expensive at $902,000? What is the probability that his price will drop significantly? And I really do think that is an important question to consider. Where our salary cap is pretty constrained at the start of the season, we want to be looking for value players where possible, as well as trying to balance that with point scoring. So what I've just tried to pull here is I've pulled Nicho Hynes' numbers from both 2022 and what he scored against the respective teams, and I've looked at a longer term view, the first 13 weeks, because that does include then his round 6 bye, as well as the major bye week in round 13. And in addition to his 2022 figures, I've looked at his career statistics against that particular team as well. So obviously, I would put less weight on the career numbers, especially with someone like Nicho Hynes, because remember, he was for a lot of the time at Melbourne playing as a utility. But I was actually kind of shocked how good his numbers were. Obviously, the fact that he was utility is kind of then offset by he got a lot of points in the 2021 season, which we know was just a general outlier for Supercoach point scoring. But essentially what you saw from last season against the 11 opponents he'll come up against in the first 13 weeks, from last season's numbers, he'll score about 950 points and maintain an average of 87. So, obviously that does make sense, and the numbers show that. If he scores how he did last year against the opponents, he'll basically maintain the same average as last year. Then if you look at his career numbers, that assumes an average of 69 over the first 13 rounds, which is obviously a big drop off from the 86, and his price would reduce. My general expectation is that I don't know if he's going to quite match what he did in 2022, and you could take a chance in that the opening few games are difficult, but then I look at games against like Dragons round 4, Warriors round 5, Bulldogs round 8, Dolphins round 10, Newcastle round 12, even Manly round 11. There are some good games definitely in the first 13 weeks of the season. And so for me, where I think in terms of his expectation of average, I kind of put it maybe slightly down from the 87, but higher definitely than the 69. If I had to guess, I'd probably say that Hynes is going to average around 80 points for the first 13 weeks of the season. Now, obviously that does suggest that he will reduce in price, but it's a difficult one because I don't think that's as big of a drop-off then that you all of a sudden have to say he's not going to maintain his price tag, therefore I'm going to avoid him altogether, because a bloke averaging 80 over the first few weeks is obviously really strong. And so for me, I'm kind of about 70-30 in terms of starting with Nicho Hynes versus not starting with him. I do feel like if we get a lack of cheapies elsewhere in, say the center wing or the second row forward, and then we need to start kind of putting more money into those positions just to make sure that they've got a bit of better depth, I do feel like Nicho Hynes will be the first one that I do sacrifice. There are a lot of broader questions as well about squad structure, which I'll probably address a little bit more towards the end of the video. Like, for example, do you prioritize Harry Grant or Nicho Hynes? Do you go with Tanah Boyd? We'll definitely talk about Tanah Boyd as well in this video. So for me personally, just to kind of summarize my thoughts on Hynes, I'm 70-30 in terms of starting with him versus not starting with him. I think his place in my team will really come down to the availability of other cheapies that we've got in other positions, but I don't think he will drop off big enough that would make me concerned about not starting with him. I'm confident enough that the point scoring will still be there. Even those tougher games, Rabbitohs and Parramatta, if I wanted to refer back to my best draw video, which was the first one I did that preseason, one thing I did highlight was that the Rabbitohs and the Eels are still good teams that do concede points. So even though they're tough fixtures on paper, I do still think that someone like Nicho Hynes, you saw last year, he scored 74 average against the Rabbitohs and 101 average against the Eels. Even if that kind of tones down to say 70 and 85, you'd probably take that in the opening 2 weeks of the season as well. So I don't think Hynes' point scoring is going to drop off massively. I don't quite think he's going to hit that 86 average that he's priced at. That's why I'm not 100% locked into my team to start with Nicho Hynes. But look, there's a good chance that I will end up going with him. but if I need to spread the money, he was probably going to be the sacrificial lamb. Now, going back to some of the other gun players now that we've kind of had that deep dive of Nicho Hynes. So the other four that I did think about were Mitchell Moses, Jerome Hughes, Daly Cherry Evans, and Sam Walker. So Mitchell Moses, he had a great 2022 season with an average of 70. I personally am not looking at starting with Moses to begin the season. Similar to what I've said already with Sean Lane, I'll probably say the same thing about Dylan Brown, unfortunately, is that Parramatta's opening draw is quite tough, right? You've got Melbourne, Sharks, Manly, Penrith, Roosters in the first 5 weeks of the season. For me, Moses had a bit of a career year, in my opinion, for SuperCoach point scoring. And so I'm a bit more confident thinking that his scoring will reduce for those opening 5 weeks of the season. It gives me some time to kind of assess. And then come round 6, Parramatta do go into a really nice run of games, and Parramatta are very good coverage during the State of Origin and the major bye weeks. They play in every one of the major bye rounds. So that's something that I've said about Sean Lane that I do think similarly about Mitchell Moses. I think he's a good pickup at round 6. Hopefully his price has dropped as well at that point. And then at that point, I do think he will offer some value. For me personally, though, I just don't think I'll be going there to start the season. I actually prefer someone like a Jerome Hughes to Mitchell Moses. And I think if you're not looking to go with Hynes, but not looking to go all the way down to say like a Tanah Boyd, I think for me, Jerome Hughes and Sam Walker were the two that did stand out to me. The reason I don't mind Hughes is that he's normally pretty consistent. 55% of games over 60 is pretty solid. And he does have a ceiling. 20% of his games last season, he did score over 100, which is actually a pretty solid figure. Quite a bit of a pod, obviously, at the moment at only 4% ownership. The downside with Hughes is that he doesn't goal kick. Cleary, Moses, and Hynes, even even Sam Walker, they're all goal kickers, which really does help with their scoring average, and that's noted in the chart below me. The scoring average for all the goal kickers is definitely higher than someone like Jerome Hughes, who's at 11. So that's the downside with Hughes, but he does have good draw. That's why I do like him. Parramatta round 1, who can concede points. Bulldogs, Titans, and West Tigers then in rounds 2, 3, and 4. They are good games on paper. So I think if you're after a pod and if you're looking to save money, but you don't have to sacrifice all the way down to a Tanah Boyd, I do like starting with someone like a Jerome Hughes. Very tough one between him and Sam Walker, because obviously Sam Walker is a much, much bigger price saving compared to Hughes. You're saving an extra $100,000. But then again, not as consistent. Only 33% of his games he scored over 60 last season. 8% of his games over 100. So while he does have a ceiling, he didn't really show that as much as Jerome Hughes in 2022. The first 2 games are really enticing, right? You've got the Dolphins and you've got the Warriors in the first 2 weeks of the season. Problem with Sam Walker, though, is after the first 2 rounds, rounds 3 onwards do get tougher for the Roosters, and you are throwing in a bye as well in round 4. So if you're running like a Cleary Sam Walker combination, you are going to have your halves have back-to-back byes in rounds 3 and 4, which obviously does hamper then the kind of initial upside that you'll get in your team. Someone else who picks like a Jerome Hughes, for example, in the week that Cleary's off with a bye, you can plug in Hughes for the Titans. And then again, you got the West Tigers in round 4. So Hughes is really good, I think, with Cleary as a combination to manage the byes, for example, early on. And he does have those good games. So I'd probably slightly think that the combination of Hughes and Cleary is better than Sam Walker, but I do understand the price saving that you get with Walker. Quickly mention Cherry Evans as well. I'm not really too interested in Cherry Evans. I think if he's goal kicking, we're always going to like Cherry Evans at that point. He's actually relatively consistent. 64% of games he scored over 60, but I think if I were to extend the numbers to like over 70 and 80, didn't really happen as much of the time. But Cherry Evans always seems to go on a bit of a run, so he will get interest, I think, at some point. But with an early buy in round 2, if Garrick's available in goal kicking, I don't really see too much upside in Cherry Evans. And so I quickly also wanted to just get onto this slide as well, where I was looking at the kind of career averages of each of these different halfbacks against their respective opponents, all the way up until round 13. For me, it's probably a little bit too harsh on Mitchell Moses, where his average obviously doesn't look quite good at 48. I would expect that to probably increase to say like the 55 to 60 mark. But again, with those opening first 5 weeks being quite tough, Moses doesn't quite cut it for me. But look, round 6 to 10, you can see a really good run of games there. And I can see Moses being a very popular purchase at that point in time. And especially if Nicho Hynes has the buy in round 6 as well. So if Hynes hasn't been delivering, you may see people do a perfect switch from Hynes to Moses, then to manage the buy period and origin period. But definitely not one I'm looking to start with. When I did this exercise, it kind of did firm up in my head that Hughes and Walker were probably the 2 next best after Cleary and Nicho Hynes in the more gun category of halfbacks. Walker's career average is probably slightly inflated because he did play, obviously, in that 2021 superior SuperCoach scoring season and obviously has less of a sample size than someone like a Jerome Hughes. So even Jerome Hughes' average probably isn't super reflective, but a career average of 61 against those opponents is not too bad. I'd expect that to actually increase to about 65. So again, I do feel like Hughes probably has a better draw overall compared to the Roosters if you're looking for a long-term option at your halfback slot. So I think Hughes probably for me is the next best after Cleary and Hynes, but very closely followed by Sam Walker. Obviously, you're not seeing a very big difference between Hughes and Sam Walker. I just think Hughes probably has slightly more pedigree and just, I think overall a better draw, slightly weakened by the fact that he doesn't goal kick. But look, I think he's a good enough option that if you are looking for a pod in your halfback, I do think he's pretty solid. But personally, I think if you can't make this kind of a decision, then it's just very easy to default to Cleary and Hynes with the knowledge that you can always downgrade someone like Nicho Hynes to one of these other guys, as instead of kind of having to make that case of starting with someone like Jerome Hughes. And then if Hynes goes bang, bang in the first 2 weeks, you're thinking, oh my God, I need to get like an extra 150k to get to Nicho Hynes. That's where you might have some difficulties. Hence why I'm leaning towards starting with Hynes, but I do like Hughes and Walker as the next best 2 options. Now, taking a look at some mid-range / value options, in all honesty, I'm really not convinced by any of these guys, maybe apart from Tanah Boyd. The 385k, I think there are a lot of questions coming in about him in terms of, is he better for squad structure? Instead of having him at your hook spot, maybe have him at your halfback spot. Going from Nicho Hynes down to Tanah Boyd, it releases like $500,000, which you can use to spread amongst the rest of your team. So I kind of wanted to tackle a few of the questions that were quite common around Tanah. So the first one I think was, is he better to put in at your hooker or at your halfback spot? Now, personally, I'm quite locked in, I think, with the Harry Grant and Brandon Smith combination at hooker. I think if you were looking to sacrifice Harry Grant and go Brandon Smith and Tanah Boyd, that's fine. But I've got more reservations, I think, about Nicho Hynes being able to match his performance from last year compared to, say, like a Harry Grant. I know that might sound a bit crazy, and Nicho Hynes definitely has a bigger ceiling than Harry Grant, but I'm just more comfortable, I think, with locking in Harry Grant as, by far the best hooker. I don't feel that way about Nicho Hynes. Nathan Cleary, in my opinion, is the best halfback, and he's cheaper than Nicho Hynes. So that's why I'm thinking if I were to go cheaper with that backup, I'd probably do it in the halfback spot. So say run the Tanah Boyd and Nathan Cleary combination. Obviously, the slight downside is that Panthers do have a bye in round 3 quite early on. And in that week, Tanah Boyd has got Melbourne. So it's a bit of a tough opposition that you'll have to play against. He had one game against Melbourne last year as a starting half and he scored 35 points, which, look, for 1 week, if you can cop a 35, it's okay. But ideally, obviously, you'd want to get more than 35. You might want like a 50, 60 plus. My thoughts on that can definitely change. I can also see the argument where your halfback spot is higher upside than your hooker. So you're more happy to take, Tanah Boyd's 35, 40 point game in round 4, I think, when Brandon Smith has the bye, instead of, say, when Cleary has the bye in round 3. But my overall kind of concern, I guess, with Tanah Boyd is more the draw than anything else. So his numbers when he did start as a half last year were really good. So I've got those numbers actually below me in the column chart, hence why it looks a lot higher than someone like Sean Johnson or Lachlan Ilias. It was an average of 57 in the 8 games that he was starting as a half, and pretty good scoring average of 18 because we expect him to be goal kicking. My concern is that, let's say he bangs out a 70 in round 1 and a 70 in round 2, he's going to obviously be tipped to make a lot of cash. But then you are running into Melbourne, the Cowboys, and then a bye. So yes, he could go up a lot in value in round 3, but the concern is that if he then goes back down to, say, like mid-30 scores, that might very quickly cap his cash growth. And then by round 5, you're thinking, oh, he's got a bye. Maybe you want to convert him to another halfback, but maybe you haven't made enough money on him. That's maybe where some of the concern is with Tanah Boyd. And because he's obviously, they'll be working on it in pre-season, but he is a new half in their team for round 1. So I think, slight question marks, I think, around how the Titans are going to click with Tanah Boyd as a starting half. And again, maybe a risk where if it doesn't quite work out the first opening rounds, the Titans can maybe switch things up. He's not super locked into that role. So that makes me think that I want to maybe wait and watch on Tanah. I know rounds 1 and 2 look really good and he's got good potential to score well in that time. But if he does well, I can still maybe, he still will be fairly cheap. Even if he goes up $60,000, $70,000, he'll only be like, say, 450k. So let's say if I want to go back to him in the future, I'm not going to still be, spending a crazy amount of money, I guess, to get him. So I'm happy to be wrong and then make the switch rather than be wrong from the beginning and then have to struggle to try to get rid of him, if that makes any sense. Round 6 onwards, the Titans draw, I believe, does improve as well. So maybe round 6 is the time that I might look to target him. But I'm personally not looking, I think, at starting with Tanah Boyd. If I were to go with my halves, Cleary is locked, and then I think if I weren't going with Nicho Hynes, I'd probably actually look instead to someone like Sam Walker or Jerome Hughes, as I've spoken about previously in this video. So I'll still be saving like $200-something thousand, but just not quite compromising. And again, that still gives me an exit route where if Sam Walker flops, Jerome Hughes flops, Tanah Boyd starts really well, I've got that option to, I guess, move down to him a little bit more easily in that sense. So that's my general thoughts on Tanah Boyd. I'll quickly rattle off, my thoughts on some of these guys though. Like Jamal Fogarty had a pretty good end of 2022, but I think his overall pedigree doesn't really suggest that that's something he'll be able to maintain. He is goal kicking, which is a plus, for the Raiders, but again, 658k, you're paying quite a lot. Sam Walker is cheaper, and I'd much prefer Sam Walker, I think, to Fogarty. I think Walker has shown more pedigree from a SuperCoach standpoint than Jamal, so he's probably not going to be an option that I would recommend. Similar with Sean O'Sullivan, moving over to the Dolphins, I'd expect him to be the starting number 7. We just don't know anything about the Dolphins, whether they're going to click early on. We expect that they're probably going to be a team that's struggling. So how many points can they score? Again, very up in the air. And I think 650k isn't quite an option for me. There was a question as well that did come in about Adam Reynolds. Now, again, Reynolds actually showed glimpses in 2022 of actually outperforming his kind of historical SuperCoach, pedigree. Typically, we see Adam Reynolds as that kind of 55 to 60 average guy and really doesn't deviate from that. Obviously, he ended up on that at 60.5 for 2022, but he did have glimpses where he had a bit of a 4 to 5 week period where he was averaging around the 70s to 80s. My feeling is with Penrith and the Cowboys in the first 2 weeks of the season, the draw does open up after that. So I see no real reason to start with Reynolds. Wait and watch for the first 2 weeks, and if it looks good, you've got nice games from rounds 3 onwards. At that point, I think you could maybe take a chance on Reynolds, but definitely not someone I'd recommend, I think, to start the season. Ben Hunt has the bye round 1, so again, that weighs down in his favor. Dragons actually do have a pretty good run from round 2 onwards. You've got the Titans, Broncos, Sharks, Dolphins, and Titans again. So it is solid. The base stats with Ben Hunt always scare me. He had a base stat average of 15 last season, and I'm pretty sure he had games where he literally scored less than 10 points overall because he just doesn't have base stats to back it up when he's playing at halfback. Obviously, when he's playing at hooker, different story, but he'll play at number 7 for the Dragons. Again, Dragons, we've got a few question marks about them, so not really looking there. Hastings may be an option with Newcastle. I mean, Newcastle have got a pretty good draw for the first 6 weeks of the year. I feel like Hastings has been brought to be a bit more of a game manager. I don't think from a SuperCoach point of view, he's really going to explode or anything like that. I mean, Hastings did have a good end to the 2022 season, but that was when he was playing at lock for the Tigers, and he finished with scores of 86, 62, and 61. But prior to that, I'm seeing games of 31, 48, 21, 57, 25, 44, 48, 64. I think you're kind of getting the picture. I think I'm more expecting for him to score more in the 40s than in the 60s. So for me, Hastings isn't really an option for me either. Now, Sean Johnson, I know people were a little bit excited by that Instagram picture he posted up in the preseason. Look, he did look very good. I can't trust Sean Johnson, I think, to maybe stay healthy, but also 2 is just to return back to that kind of SuperCoach gun that we all once knew and loved. I mean, the Warriors draw, again, it's not the best on paper. It's kind of a mixed bag. You've got Newcastle round 1, which is good, but then it's immediately followed up by the Roosters and Cowboys. Bulldogs is fine, but the Bulldogs could be improved by that point. Then you've got the Sharks, and then you've got Newcastle again. So for me, really, the draw doesn't scream, anything like we have to go to Sean Johnson or he's worth the punt. Someone like someone from Newcastle, for example, not Hastings, but if someone was to make an argument about taking a punt on like a Ponga, you can kind of make that argument a little bit better because they've got that draw to back it up. I just don't think the Warriors have the draw to back it up, but I also just think Sean Johnson he's not going to get back to that gun that we all once knew. So for me, I can't personally recommend him. Lachlan Illis, I'll quickly finish up with him. I really don't think he's a good option. We all started with him last year, but that was because we thought he was a good cash cow. Really tough opening start to the season. Only 9% of games he scored over 60, average of 35. I just don't see the appeal with Ilias. He won't make money for you, whereas at least Tanah Boyd will. So for me, Ilias isn't really an option to consider. Now, I'll quickly round out the video with a bit of a summary on Q&A and as well as some cheapies. Isaiah Katoa is quite popular in the Supercoach game. He's almost bottom dollar, listed as a 5'8" halfback. I personally don't think running with him is a good idea because I don't think he's actually going to start for them in the halves. I expect the Dolphins starting halves to be Sean O'Sullivan and Anthony Milford. And so if you're stuck with a bottom price dollar, non-player, and then you've got Nathan Cleary with the bye very early on in the season, automatically you're going to be struggling to get any points in your halfback spot. So for me, I cannot recommend Katoa as a start in your team. If you want to save money there, instead, I think just go with Tanah Boyd. At least you know that he should be playing. And so for me, I can't recommend Katoa. I wanted to also highlight Pezet. I believe he's from the Storm. I'll be honest, I don't really know much about this person, but I've heard that he's potentially maybe next in line for the Storm if there were to be issues there. So again, I think one to wait and watch on, but no need to start with him, I guess, in our round one teams. And so I wanted to end by kind of addressing this question from MySpace Legend, which was that he's locked into Brandon Smith, Nathan Cleary, and Tanah Boyd. It's not necessarily a halfback question, but it's about the Grant or Hynes conundrum. I kind of already, I think, spoke about that quite a bit in the last section around Tanah Boyd. My feeling is I'd rather sacrifice Hynes than Harry Grant. But I did want to bring up this Twitter poll from Supercoach by Adrianosaurus, who does his own podcast as well as co-partnering with Josh on the dual position. I just wanted to bring it up because I also thought it was quite interesting. He was only 100 votes in, so obviously the numbers could change. But majority actually were looking to start with Harry Grant over Nicho Hynes. So I might not be the only one who's thinking that they'd rather have Harry Grant than Nicho Hynes. But again, I'll be umming and ahhing it, I think, all the way through the preseason up until deadline for round one. Alright guys, that's my halfback position guide. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. As I mentioned, we're 13 subscribers away from the Magic 2000 figure. So if you guys enjoy the video, really appreciate a thumbs up, and do please consider subscribing as well if you do enjoy the content. Next video will be on the 5/8. So hit me with all your questions around the 5/8 and we'll get into the hot topics for that. But until then, see you all in the next video.